I would like to talk about parenting, specifically about something that I call arranged marriage. And I would like to start with a little review of where this study came from. So a few years ago, my wife, Ola Terrace, who is a co-author on this paper, comes to me and says, can you suggest any literature on arranged friendship? So she just made up this term, so she knew about arranged marriage, parental involvement in selection of spouses for their children. And she assumed there is an established body of research on arranged friendship, where parents are involved in selection of friends for their children. And when she asked about that, initially I thought, sure, why not? I mean, I'm sure there is some literature. So I go online and try to look for it, and there is absolutely nothing. So then we search more extensively and literally find nothing on arranged friendship. The term essentially does not exist. So we found a lot of literature on friendship development. That's when or how the sense of friendship, the feeling of friendship develops between people. But that's just the basic psychological construct or sociological construct. Then we found a lot of research on helicopter parenting. So there is this research on parental neglect. That's when parents are not enough involved in their children's lives. And then the opposite of that is helicopter parenting. So basically when parents are involved so much, they hover over their children all the time, just like helicopters, and are trying to control every domain of life of their children. So it's a very general construct, has nothing to do with arranged friendship per se. So it's a general involvement in children's affairs, lots of research on that. Obviously, there is a lot of research on arranged marriage. So a lot of, literally over 2 billion hits if you Google arranged marriage, and about 40,000 papers on Google Scholar on arranged marriage. But when it comes to arranged friendship, again, parental involvement in selection of friends for their children, we could find only one, literally just one single paper, and it's a book chapter actually from 1984. So nothing really else. So the goal of this study then became to develop this construct of arranged friendship, define its dimensionality and facets, then develop an instrument for measuring it, and then conduct a cross-cultural comparison to see how this practice or value is developed or prevalent around the world in different countries. And so we did find some research on helicopter parenting as far as how parents can be involved in their children's lives. Like, for example, fairness, going to school every time the child gets low grade and making sure that the child is treated fairly. Or consumer advocacy, again, every time a child is enrolled in some summer camp, making sure that the child is, taken care of and fully protected and, treated well by the caregivers. Safety patrol, the same thing, coming and making sure that there are no dangers and no hazards for the child and things like that. All the way to top college student where parents sometimes are even involved in the on-campus affairs of their children. Now adults, not really children. And then all the way to toxic parenting where the involvement is so big that it basically becomes toxic. So we found, for example, literature that says that helicopter parenting has negative consequences. Children have lower self-esteem, harder time adapting to new realities of life, depression and things like that. But again, that's a very different line of research. So for our study, as I said, we found only one book chapter that kind of talked about how parents can be involved in selection of friends for their children. And that was that one book chapter that talked about things like, for example, setting the stage. So kind of like choosing the right neighborhood so that children can play with those children from the good neighborhood. Or arranging social contacts, like, for example, scheduling play dates for your kids, or enrolling your kids in special, in clubs or some other activities where they can meet other children from, for example, good families. Or maybe coaching them on how to, deal with potential friends or potential, not good friends. But we thought that was a little too simplistic, so we developed our own model that has 5 dimensions of how parents can be involved in arranging friendship for their children. And so those include permission, so basically allowing or not allowing their children to play with some kids and not others. Defining the friend pool, again, choosing where to live, what school to go to, so that the kids that the children interact with are the kids that I want my children to be friends with. Preference for neighborhood and family. Again, by default, my children may play with the cousins, basically other kids in my family, or maybe the immediate neighborhood, the kids who live across the street. But I can take the action and can take my kids further away so that they not only associate with the family and neighborhood kids, but maybe also make friends from, I don't know, some better neighborhoods, or maybe through some clubs. Celebrations, again, I as a parent, for example, can be involved in inviting kids to birthday parties, or maybe not allowing my kids to invite some kids to birthday parties. And then finally, parents, friends. So that's where sort of my friends, friends of the parents, sort of become a pool of friends for my children. And sometimes parents can literally choose who they are friends with, kind of cultivate the right types of relationships with other adults, so that through them, my children can become friends with their children. And that happens probably more often than you think. I mean, you probably have seen people who sort of try to befriend the right people so that my kids are friends with their kids, and vice versa, try to stay away from some other people because I don't want my kids to be friends with their kids. And so we created 3 versions of the survey that measures those 5 dimensions. So we had a version of the survey that we call sort of is. So all of the questions in that survey start with in this country. So for example, for kids ages 6 to 13, could you please describe the role parents play in selecting their kids in this country or in your country? So basically that's a description of what is in a specific country. Then the second version of the survey is what I call was. So same question, but this time not describing what is now, but describing your own experience as a child. So growing up, how much your parents were involved in your selection of friends. So basically you describe your own experience in the past when you were a child. And then the third version is the should be. So basically in this case, what do you believe is right? How much parents should be involved in selection of friends of their children. So kind of similar like GLOBE, should be and is practices and values. But in this case, we have practices, values, and sort of practices at the time when I was a child. So my own experience. Now, the whole instrument has 19 items. And here are some of the examples of what those items might be. Like for example, when it comes to permission, one of the items reads, kids usually cannot have friends not approved by their parents. So that's for the is version. So in this country, kids usually cannot have friends not approved by their parents. True, false, agree, disagree, to what extent. Celebrations, parents play a big role in deciding who is invited to their kids' birthday parties, and so on, right? So to compare those values and practices around the world, we conducted a survey that involved 7,488 people, 81 people. The survey was designed in a way that the respondents would be given a randomly chosen one of the 3 versions of the survey. So some would randomly be asked to describe what's going on in their country now. Some were randomly asked to describe what was going on in the country when they were children, so their own experience, and then 1/3 were answering the should be the values version. All of those were students, and I think that's a very suitable sample here, actually, perhaps even the perfect sample. So it has nothing to do with convenience. We wanted people who are now mature enough to answer questions thoughtfully and knowledgeably, but at the same time not too old to the point where they sort of don't remember how things are done in their country now or when they were kids. If you ask people who are too old, as I said, the memory may not serve them well. It may be more sort of the way you remember it, not really the way it was. Likewise, they're now far removed from how things are done with kids and parents today in the country, so they may not even know what are the traditions and norms today. So we thought a pool of people who are in their early 20s may be a perfect pool because they still remember, they still understand the concept, they just went through it. And at the same time, they're already mature enough to answer those questions knowledgeably. And so as you see, we had about 2.5, 2.3 thousand people for each of the versions of the survey. So they came from 145 countries total by self-declared home country. And we also knew where they are located at the time of the study. And so we had people ages 10 to 61 actually, but most of them were 22.3 on average in terms of the age, about half and half male and female. Now, in terms of the quality of the instrument, surprisingly, the results were pretty good. So all three versions of the instrument had a very high reliability. So for all 19 items, it was close to 0.9, 0.87, 0.87, 0.89, which is very, pleasant to know, because you spend all that time collecting the data, you never know what you're going to get. We were lucky, we got pretty good results here. The reliability is a little bit lower if you look at individual dimensions, but based on the factor analysis and based on the additional analysis, it seems like even though there is enough distinction among those 5 dimensions, so they kind of refer to different types of practices and values, but overall it's probably one single construct, because it seems like overall we get pretty much, there is a consistency from one factor to another. So you should probably be talking about arranged friendship as one construct, not as 5 distinct separate constructs. It's 5-dimensional, but not necessarily 5 completely independent practices and values. Now, this is what the results look like. So we had basically rankings of the nations with the results on was, is, and should be, and combined, as well as for each of the individual of the 5 factors. But I'm not going to get into the details about each country. I'll just give you kind of general overview. So what we found was that generally, the more developed the country is, be it based on GDP or HDI, the less parents are involved in the affairs of their children. So the more autonomy the parents give their children with respect to selection of friends. So usually in rich countries, children kind of have a lot of say who are they friends with. In poor countries, parents have a much tighter control over who their children are friends with. But, and this is very interesting, there was one very notable exception, and that is basically the United States. The United States and Canada. So they were very similar to actually developing countries, if I can use that term. So the United States was right between basically Middle Eastern and African countries. So very, very different type of values. Canada similar to that. It's almost like what you see for religiosity. Usually the more developed the country is, the less religious it is, with the exception of the United States that is very developed, but also very religious. And it's a very, very similar idea here. So you also see that sort of relationship here. Another very interesting observation is that because we had people of different ages and we were asking about them how it was when they were children, we kind of got this time dimension. So we could see how things were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago and how they are now. And so we saw that around the world, parental involvement in arranging friendships for their children is actually on the downward trajectory. So parents are less and less involved in selection of friends for their children. Children have more and more autonomy. And remarkably, it's the opposite in the United States. It's actually growing. So it's going up, and parents are even more involved in their children's affairs with respect to selection of friends than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. So not quite sure why. It would be probably a good research for future studies, good research question for future studies, but this is the trend we see. And I'm going to stop here. So as I said, I hope you will find this topic interesting and worthy of future research. I mean, obviously we can look at what predicts arranged friendship, what are the consequences of arranged friendship, maybe conduct this survey in more countries, maybe with different demographics. But as far as the introduction, it seems to me that we got this construct pretty well developed. And so we have some data to compare them internationally just to see how things differ from one country to another.